Late night passenger. When I was younger, chasing money at all hours of the night seemed necessary. I picked up a side job as an Uber driver. The job wasn't glamorous, but driving around the big city was something I enjoyed. Every day after 5 p.m., I'd grab a quick bite and begin my Uber shifts. Most nights ended around 2 a.m. This story took place on one of those long nights, about 6 months after working 2 jobs simultaneously. There was a hospital downtown with a large parking lot. It became my regular spot to take short naps while waiting for rides. It was quiet, away from the city noise. That night, after hours of driving, I went there to rest. I didn't plan on sleeping long, just a 15-minute nap. When I woke up, I couldn't remember where I was for a few minutes. I glanced at the dashboard, and only 15 minutes had passed. My music playlist was still playing, soft and mellow. I checked my phone, hoping I hadn't missed any ride requests. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart stop. A man was suddenly sitting in the back seat. He was right behind me, just staring. Then he smiled, a creepy, unsettling grin. I turned to face him, and sure enough, he was there. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn and dirty, and he only wore one shoe. His face was grimy, and he seemed exhausted, like he had been on the streets for a while. Something wasn't right with him. I didn't know how long he had been there, how he got in, or what he wanted. I glanced at his hand, and there it was, an open phone displaying the Uber app. My mind started racing. Maybe he had wandered out of the hospital, saw my car running, and thought it was his ride. I tried to stay calm. "Hey, are you waiting for a ride?" He didn't respond right away. His eyes darted from the roof of the car to the floor, avoiding my gaze. I pointed to his phone, hoping he understood. I asked again, "Do you need a ride?" He nodded. The gesture was slow, cautious, and uneasy. I forced a smile and told him I'd take him where he needed to go. I tried to act normal, to ease the tension in the car. But deep down, something about this man wasn't right. I left the hospital parking lot, following his vague directions to an old, closed-down music venue downtown. Then it hit me. I hadn't accepted a ride request on the Uber app. This guy wasn't my passenger. I glanced at the rear-view mirror again. His phone didn't show any ride request. He wasn't connected to me at all. I spoke, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just realized this ride hasn't been registered. Can you find me on the app quickly?" That's when his entire demeanor changed. He scoffed, looking out the window, then turned to me with a cold expression, saying he wasn't going to pay for the ride. I nervously chuckled, hoping it was a joke, but he remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew tense. I glanced at him again and noticed a hospital discharge bracelet on his wrist and a dirty backpack beside him. I was trapped in the car with a homeless drifter who must have snuck in while I was asleep. I needed to get him out. I told him I wasn't giving him a free ride across town, and that he was lucky I hadn't called the police. But before I could grab my phone, he lunged and wrapped his hands around my neck. His hands were rough, calloused. I struggled trying to pry his fingers off, but he was too strong. A stench emanated from him. I could barely breathe. Instinct kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the brake. The sudden stop sent him flying forward, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I swerved toward the curb. He was dazed. I shifted the car into park, dialed 911, and honked the horn. He groaned, recovering from the impact, and started coming at me again. But this time, I wasn't powerless. I screamed into the phone, describing everything as fast as I could. Then, as if he realized the game was over, he grabbed his backpack and bolted out of the car, vanishing into the night. A few blocks away, the police caught up to him. I watched as they cuffed him. Later, I found out he had escaped from the hospital after being admitted for an overdose. He wasn't just a drifter, he was dangerous, and I had escaped something terrible. As the night came to a close, the only thought in my mind was, I'll never forget to lock my car doors again. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle, attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train, barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep, and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible, faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural. Take the wrong Uber driver. It was late November, and we had a small party. I stumbled out of the bar into the freezing cold air. I stood on the sidewalk, the world around me spinning slightly, my mind foggy from the alcohol. My friends stayed behind, eager to celebrate a little longer, but I had a flight to catch the next morning. I needed to pack. I needed to sleep, so I booked an Uber to take me home. I opened the app, and luckily, a driver accepted almost instantly. The app showed it would arrive in 4 minutes. Then, a car pulled up. The car's headlights flashed at me. From a distance, I thought I saw someone wave at me from the window. I was tired, and maybe my app was just glitching. The driver must have arrived early, that's all. Without thinking much, I stumbled into the car. Inside, the car smelled faintly of old cigarettes, and the seat creaked beneath me. I glanced at the driver in the front seat. He didn't look back at me, didn't say a word. He didn't even confirm my name. I just wanted to get home. I muttered my address and leaned back in the seat. It was then that I noticed the GPS on his dashboard was turned off. I was startled. Why hadn't he entered my address into his GPS? Everyone uses GPS for Uber, even drivers familiar with the area. I watched him drive, hoping he just knew the route well. The car sped down the street, but something felt off. This wasn't the way to my dorm. I nervously told him.
I think you're going the wrong way. My school is in the opposite direction.
For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, he glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded, but he didn't turn the car around. He just kept driving. I started to panic. Where was he taking me? The car stopped in front of a rundown office building. The street was deserted. Why had he stopped here? He didn't say a word. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Slamming the door shut, my mind raced. My hands trembled as I slowly pulled out my phone. My heart sank when I saw the missed calls from my actual Uber driver. I'd gotten into the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. I was in danger. I needed to get out now. I quickly sent my location to a friend via text. If I called the police, he might hear me. But then I heard a slow, low chuckle. I looked up through the window, and there he was, smirking at me, staring. He circled the car. My hand moved toward the door, pressing down the lock. He hadn't noticed. I frantically moved from door to door, locking each one in a frenzy. The faint noise alerted him. His smile vanished, his eyes narrowed in anger. He stepped closer to the driver's door, his hand reaching for the handle. When it didn't open, he angrily pulled at it, yelling, "Open the door!" I knew I only had a few seconds left. Desperate, not waiting any longer, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, hoping they could get there faster. I didn't get a chance to speak. The sound of glass shattering stopped me, and I screamed as I saw him punch the window with his bare hand, glass flying everywhere. His arm pushed through the broken window. I dropped my phone, desperately trying to get away from him, clutching the door handle on the other side, frantically unlocking it to escape before he could grab me. I ran as fast as I could since he was injured and stuck with his hand in the broken window. I couldn't stop. I stumbled but kept running, my body filled with overwhelming terror. The night was pitch black, with the only light coming from the distant glow of the city. The abandoned lot stretched endlessly, nowhere to hide. But I kept running, praying that somehow I would survive. I spotted a small store up ahead, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the distance. My legs burned, but I didn't dare look back, not until I reached the store. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking with fear. The store clerk stared at me, wide-eyed in surprise. But I was thankful I had escaped him. The police arrived minutes later. 2 patrol cars stopped in front of the office building where the car had been parked. But when they got there, the car and the man were gone. Only shattered, blood-stained glass remained. The police reassured me that they would search for him. It was a hard lesson learned that I must always be more careful when going out alone, especially when I'm not fully alert. Horror story about a truck driver. I started driving trucks at the age of 25 and also encountered many strange cases on the road. I'm pretty sure I've encountered a few UFO while driving at night and occasionally encountered many strange drivers. The story I share with you today is the most horrifying and strange experience I have ever witnessed. In observation, I was 37 years old in 2009. That night was like most nights. I drove and listened to music on the radio, drinking some coffee to keep myself awake. The roads here are very deserted and covered in fog. Gradually, the fog got thicker and thicker, and I started thinking about whether I should pull over for a while or keep driving. I thought so, but in the end, I still chose to continue driving. At this time, there was no one on the country road, so it was probably safe to continue driving. To prevent bad situations from happening, such as an animal or something running across the road, I drove slowly. While I was concentrating on driving, I suddenly smelled something. I thought the smell of sodium carbonate was the worst smell I had ever smelled, but this smell is much worse. This smell quickly filled the inside of my truck. I quickly rolled up the window, but the smell didn't get much better. This horrible smell in my car, and I feel like I could vomit immediately. This smell mixed with the bones creates a disgusting smell. I think nothing can cause a more terrible stench than this. At the same time, I felt an uncomfortable feeling in my throat. That feeling when you want to vomit, but have to hold back. Opened the car door and started vomiting. When I was done, I quickly covered my nose because the smell was still in the air. I got in the car and calmed myself down to start driving again. That's when I noticed something crossing the road. The figure was of a man, and he was limping. In addition to his limping gait, I also noticed that the man was wearing an old white button-down shirt and black slacks. I reminisced about the strange and bizarre cases I had encountered. I don't know what to do with that man. Finally, I decided to drive over to ask if he was okay and if he needed me to call for help. Before I drove up to him, I soon realized that 4 more people were coming out from the side of the road. They were all going in the same direction as the first man I saw. They all walked with a strange limp. They all wore old-fashioned peasant clothes. What I found most strange was that they didn't realize there was a big truck going on the other side of the road. I thought to myself, if these people needed help, they would definitely come towards me. However, they all continued to limp across the street, disappearing into the darkness and fog. I emphasized again that I was in the middle of the speedway, meaning there were no houses or anything around. Then another figure stepped out from the darkness and kept crossing the street. However, this figure is much shorter. I got out of my truck, but didn't go to that kid. I just stood there, staring at it. It didn't seem to pay any attention to me. It continued to cross the road. The boy's gait and the clothes he wore were as strange as the previous ones. Just as the boy was about to reach the other end of the street, I shouted,
"Do you need any help?"
The boy stopped and turned his head to face me. My heart sank as soon as. It is a body without a face. I cursed under my breath and stood there in fear. Then it let out the most terrible scream I've ever heard, limping towards me but at a faster speed than before. I quickly got into the truck and slammed the door. The horrifying screams became more and more frequent, louder, and more people came out from the darkness. I quickly drove away from the boy, accelerating to get out of this place as soon as possible. During the escape, those people were approaching, all of them faceless. When I drove to a residential area, I stopped at a gas station. I just sat there in my truck because my mind and heart were still shaking. My mind was blank. This experience has opened up so many things to me. I understand that this world is really strange, and there will always exist things that we never think about. The story I want to tell next is, it was early June 2017. I was taking a road trip with my 9-year-old son Tony to West Virginia to visit family. It was a long, stressful drive. My car didn't have working AC at the time, and it was an incredibly hot day, so we were a bit stressed out. By the 6-hour mark, we had left later in the day, so we were still on the road by dark. I think it was around 9 o'clock p.m. when we were still on the road, and Tom started complaining that he needed to use the bathroom. There was already tension in the car before this, but his constant complaining brought about a slight argument between the two of us. At last, I saw a blue rest area sign zoom past us on the interstate, so I veered off into the rest area. It had a small building with 2 bathrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few benches. That was it. There were no other cars parked nearby, besides some big white pickup truck. As I pulled up next to the building, Tom got out in a hurry and ran to the bathroom. I left the car on because I knew he'd be back soon. Like I said, I don't want to get into personal stuff like why we had a bit of an argument, but it seemed we were at that stage where we weren't exchanging words anymore. I figured the rest of the ride would be silent. About a minute later, the back door opened. I wanted to say something to Tom, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed quiet and drove off. I noticed that the white pickup truck parked nearby was leaving as well. I veered back onto the interstate and into the left lane, and the pickup truck did the same. I stepped on it a little, and so did he. He started flashing his lights, so I switched to the right lane thinking he was nothing but an aggressive driver. But as soon as I switched to the right, so did he. He was still flashing his lights. I pulled into the right lane and started to slow down. He sped up, still in the middle lane, and when he caught up to me, he slowed down and lowered his window. I did the same.
Hey!
And he started yelling something to me, pointing at my car. He looked like a creepy, sketchy dude at first glance. I couldn't hear a word he was saying, so he pointed for me to pull over to the side. I told Tom to keep calm. In my head, I was saying if this guy tried to do anything funny, I would floor it. The pickup pulled up behind me on the grass, and the guy came out of his truck running to my car. I put the car back in drive as my heart was racing, ready to drive, but then he screamed, "Wait!" He got to my window and said,
That's not your kid, and pointed to the back seat.
He said, "That's not your kid that got in your car." Suddenly, the back right side door opens, and I turned to see someone getting out of my car, not my son Tom. I got out from the car, screaming at the tall person who seemed to be a fully grown man, but they had already disappeared into the woods. I looked at the driver of the pickup and thanked him as I suddenly panicked, thinking about what could have happened to Tom. I got back in my car, crossed the grass between the interstate, and drove back to the rest area. The guy in the pickup followed me. We got back there in like 30 seconds to find Tom waiting outside the rest area bathroom. He got back in the car, all confused. I explained everything to him, almost out of breath, as did the pickup driver. I thanked the guy one more time before he drove back to the spot he was sitting in before. Tom was so intrigued about what just happened, and I was so disturbed that we were back on good terms again. We chatted the whole rest of the way and told family about it as soon as we arrived. I never even got to see what the person who got in my car looked like. Honestly, maybe I should be happy I never turned around to look at them because I don't know what they would have done.